Well, Shabbat Shalom and welcome everyone to another edition of Stump the Stars Jewish Style. We're glad that you joined us. We apologize for running a little bit late. You had a rather hectic schedule through the afternoon.
We've had a busy day already.
And part of the busy day explains why you see what you see me wearing.
I don't think they can quite see it, and it might be just as well.
All right. Anyhow, given all that, let's get started with a word of prayer, and then we will launch. Thanks, Father, for this time together. Thanks for another Shabbat we can celebrate. Thank you for what's coming up during the course of this week, particularly the beginning of the celebration of Passover and all that we celebrate as a result of that. And then, too, we remember, because of its Passover connection, the death and resurrection of Yeshua, our Messiah, for which we're grateful, because that's become such an important part of our lives, and it is such an important part of history. And in all these things, we're grateful as well as our time together. So for clarity, for understanding, for comprehension, we ask, but most of all for life change. In Yeshua's name. Amen. Okay. All right, then we are rolling. Now, we have one outstanding, rather lengthy and involved question from previously, but since the people who submitted that question are not with us, I think we'll set that aside, and then we'll go directly into the first of the questions that was submitted to us in the intervening period.
Which we have 3 or 4.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And they may spring into other things as well. We'll see how it goes.
Mm-hmm.
The question goes like this. Yeshua's prophecy regarding the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem was a huge historic event. Let me pause just briefly. It's a huge historic event for many of us. It may not be as huge a historical event for other peoples, but it is a lesson. On. It is said that ancient Judaism died that day. The gates were sealed and all Jews were killed. How did Judaism resurrect itself? Rome took down temples all over their world. The gospel writers reported the prophecy, but they could not validate as they were not there. In other words, validate the event because they were not there at the event. So who was responsible to awaken Judaism again? All right. Do you want to start, or do you want me to start?
I think you should start. I can fill in details.
Yes, and stop me at appropriate spots to interject whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The date of August 6th is a reasonably accurate date as to when it took place, in the year 70.
We commemorate it every year during Tish B'Av, which is approximately in the middle of August.
Yeah, depending on where, whether we have a leap year in Judaism or not. Yes, it is roughly about that time period. As it turns out, Tish B'Av, since you bring that up, commemorates not only the destruction of the Second Temple, but also the destruction of the First Temple. It commemorates when our people said no to the 2 spies out of the 12 that scouted out the land of Canaan. And it commemorates other significant events, sad events in our Jewish history. But the 2 primary ones are the destructions of the 2 temples. Destruction of the First Temple took place in the year 586 before the Common Era, in case you have forgotten that. And then this one some 650 years later. It is said that ancient Judaism died that day. The gates were sealed and all Jews were killed. Let me take the second part of that, and that is the gates were sealed is a reference, can be both a metaphorical reference and a real reference. A historic reference. A historical reference would be to the closing of Jerusalem. I'm not sure that part's correct. The imagery or the metaphor that's used here is a metaphor that's taken from Yom Kippur. And there may have been some Jews or some parts of Judaism that looked at these events as that kind of thing taking place in sort of a heavenly or spiritual religious dimension. But my response to that would be that is not necessarily true as far as the greater part of Judaism views it, or for that matter, how God views it.
Well, even in Israeli history, if Judaism died and all the Jews were killed in Jerusalem, then what happened during the second revolt, which took place in 120? So there was still enough Jews in the land.
132.
130, what's 120 then?
I'm not sure.
Okay, my understanding is the first time, so in 70 AD, Jews were no longer permitted to live in the city of Jerusalem. They went to other places in the land. They went toward the Mediterranean. A whole bunch of population went up to Galilee and settled in the Galilee. As a matter of fact, there are quite a few archaeological sites that you can go see that are in the Galilee, where they are from the Jewish communities that lived there between 70 and then he said, I thought it was 120. It's 132. In 132, then Jews were not allowed to live in the whole land. Is that correct? It was a severe.
Yeah,
it wasn't like you can live anywhere around here, but just not in Jerusalem. That was in 70. But they lived all around the land then until that second revolt.
And even there, although it intensified what happened to Jerusalem, and I'm trying to remember if that's where if there was an actual leveling of the temple area at that particular time, and of much of the city. Yeah.
And it was right after the second revolt that Rome came into Jerusalem and declared it a Roman city, and proceeded then to make it into a classic Roman city that had the street set up of the Decumanus and so the two streets set up where they cross each other, and to recreate it not as, they will not call it Jerusalem from then on, they call it Aelia Capitolina. And if you go to the old city of Jerusalem and the Cardo district in that area, they will tell you the whole story, and they will show you the Roman city that was built on top of the Jewish capital, which had its name all taken away, and Jews basically were scattered. It's that at that point, I think you have more of a scattering where Jewish families would flee from the Promised Land. They would flee across North Africa, and they would also flee to the north and the west.
I just checked our official map.
Oh, you have a thing back there.
Yeah, the one that you've used for Jerusalem through the
The
ages.
thing that's hanging up over there, it gives us all the dates.
All right, not in the year 132, but in the year 135, when the second revolt ended, that's when all Jews were thrown out of the city. That's when the leveling took place. And not only was Jerusalem named Aelia Capitolina, as Patrice mentioned, but it was at that time that Israel became Palestine.
Named after the Philistines. So the Romans didn't even want to connect the nation at all at that point with the Jewish people. And so they reverted to what they said were the earlier population, the Philistines. But remember, the Philistines are not a Semitic people. They came from the Greek islands. But then the Romans from that time on called it Palestine. And before the Romans called it that nation name, after 132.
135.
After 135, that was not a name. It was not a thing. The Romans created that name. I'm only mentioning that because just vast amounts of Sunday school material, a material that is taught to children in churches, continually calls it Palestine all the time. And so this is part of the miscommunication of what was actually going on historically. And I urge you that to check out, if you have relatives at a church or you go to a church, check out what they're teaching the kids. See what's going on in their books, because you may be shocked and annoyed by the misinformation. And once you've given it to children as the gospel, as they're growing up, it's so hard to change people's minds. Then it's very, very difficult.
In fact, this particular map and some of the ones over there says Palestine.
Palestine
in
ain't
Greco-Roman
time.
time.
And that would be, oops, that would be a misnomer.
Yeah. Bottom line then, is to build on what Patrice has just said, and then I'm going to fan out a little. Bottom line is then that Yeshua or Jesus never set foot in Palestine, nor did Moses, nor did Abraham, nor did King David, nor did any of the apostles. Pick any one of those characters. It became Palestine in 135. The revolt started in 132. It lasted to 135, and for those 3 years, in fact, under Bar Kokhba, Jewish people, in effect, in Israel had their own independent nation. They were battling, but it was still under their rule. And you even have some coins that were minted during that time period that indicate that Jerusalem was under their control.
Approximately what dates was those guys? Simon Bar
That's for
Kokhba,
130.
132.
That's 132, 135. The second revolt.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So
Where
Bar
did I
Kokhba,
get 120 from? I don't know. It's bothering me.
I looked for 120 up there and I didn't find 120 up
No,
there.
of course.
Okay, so from 132 to 135, Bar Kokhba, whom Rabbi Akiva declared to be the Messiah. He and his forces and allies were in charge of Israel, including Jerusalem. And then after that was done, after Rome, I think it was 135, destroyed Beitar, his headquarters or his fortress. From that point on, as she said, there was no longer Jerusalem, there was no longer Israel, and Jewish people were no longer part of the city of Jerusalem. They were forbidden from Jerusalem. Now, not all Jews were killed in 135. Not all Jews were killed in 70. In fact, many Jews, going back to 70, were then exiled by the Roman armies back in 70. If I remember correctly, somewhere on the order of nearly a couple 100,000 Jews were call it deported, for lack of a better term, and
Sold into slavery.
more or less sold into slavery. And I think back into Egypt was a good chunk of that. I would have to double check some of my facts on that. So 70 was a major disaster. But there was a recovery, and 132 to 135 was a major recovery. I mean, if you think back on Roman history, how many empires and nations were able to successfully challenge Rome? And yet for 3 years, Bar Kokhba and his forces were able to do exactly that.
Because if they're minting money, they really have made quite a step
Exactly.
away from Rome. They have their own currency.
And you used to be able to see some of the Bar Kokhba coins in the entrance to the Shrine of the Book, but they keep changing their displays. That's in the Israel Museum, and we've gotten to see them on a number of occasions. The question said, so we're dealt with the second part. The first part of the question is, it is said that ancient Judaism died that day. I know that there are some who have said that, but that is incorrect. And there are some, well, I won't go into who the some might be, but it is a definite misunderstanding of what actually took place. First of all, this was not the first time that Judaism was without its temple. Remember, the first temple was destroyed, and it survived very effectively the destruction of the first temple. Second temple, of course, was the temple was rebuilt into the second temple, but the second temple and its destruction was not the end of Judaism either. how do I want to put this? The assumption behind that understanding is that because there was no temple, there was no more Judaism. But as I said already, there was a Judaism the first time the temple was destroyed. You were going to say something?
I was going to say, because during the first exile, during the Babylonian exile, the synagogue idea of a synagogue was created, which is we don't have the temple, we can't do our sacrifices as we were used to do, but we can meet together and we can learn together. We can study the scrolls together and learn from and we can meet with learned rabbis together. And the synagogue is what became more and more the center of the Jewish faith as we went through history then.
Yeah. There are so many things swirling around in my head. I'm going to try to make them cohere in a more, no, make them converge in a more coherent way for you. Okay, look. Built into this assumption is the assumption that there's ancient Judaism, and then post-temple there is something called rabbinic or classic Judaism. That is different from what ancient Judaism was. Patrice just brought up the fact of the synagogue. Synagogues began to develop during the exile and were around now by exile. I'm talking about the Babylonian exile. So as people came back from Babylon, they brought along with them at least the beginning stages of the whole idea of the synagogue. We have unearthed, we have excavated somewhere between half a dozen and a dozen synagogues in Israel that existed before the destruction of the temple. Synagogues did not come into existence after the temple was destroyed. They were already in existence before the temple was destroyed.
Would you say that when Rav Shaul then visited the congregations in the diaspora, that they would have been synagogues that were in the diaspora?
Yeah.
So it would have made more sense if you were away from Jerusalem, where you couldn't use the temple because you were not in town or you're not close enough to town. So synagogues were the way that Jewish people maintained and educated each other and kept going.
Yes, synagogues were very important in the diaspora, but again, let me remind you what I said. There have been at least half a dozen to a dozen synagogues excavated in Israel from before the destruction of the temple. So they were functional in Israel. And in fact, you know that's the case because in Luke chapter 4, Yeshua is asked to read the Torah and then speak from the Haftarah portion, Isaiah, in the synagogue in Nazareth.
Mhm.
So, these are things that were already in place. Because the synagogue was in place, it made it easier to adjust Judaism after the destruction of the Second Temple. There's another part, and this is why I'm trying to bring it all together in a coherent way. There's another part another part of the story that lies behind this particular misunderstanding. And look, I'll be honest with you, in my earlier days, and I mean pre-college days, let's call it that, I had heard of this assumption that Judaism died with the destruction of the temple in the year 70, and that somehow something else another form came into being. And for many of those who held that position, the form that came into being, Rabbinic Judaism, was something that was looked down on. But the rabbis and their understanding of Judaism also predates the fall of Jerusalem in the year 70. Many of the traditions go back a long way. In fact, since we talked about archaeology, William F. Albright, who was in the 20th century, perhaps the major archaeologist of the Middle East, he suggests, and this is a paraphrase of a quote that I share in many classes, that the roots of the traditions which are often associated with the rabbis. He says, and I'm quoting him, go back to the exilic period, and then he adds he uses the term to times of antiquity, which is suggesting it even predates some of the exile. All right. The reason people think or had thought that Judaism was somehow transformed after the year 70 is because they assume or do not understand that the rabbis and the traditions predate the destruction. They assume that the rabbis after the destruction put together this reconfigured form of Judaism to enable it to exist and to survive. And to some degree, what they did enable it to exist and survive. But it wasn't formulated then, it was codified then. And those are two different things. The formulation process, as Albright suggests, goes back into days of high antiquity, back into the exilic period, certainly back to the time of Ezra and the people who were called the men of the great assembly.
The Talmudic materials.
That's what I was going to say.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, the Talmudic materials are the codifications of many of these teachings that go back to that time period. They were collected and codified, the first level of that, under the auspices of Judah HaNasi, Judah the Prince, and in the days just prior to the year 200 of the Common Era. That's the first level. They were further elaborated on it and interpreted and applied by the year 400 in Israel, the year 500 in Babylon. That's the framework of what we call the Talmud. First part of the Talmud is called Mishnah. It's codified by the year 200 thanks to Judah and those around him. The Gemara, which now forms the rest of the Talmud, and the two are actually together as you find your printed versions of the Talmud. Those were codified, like I said, by the year 400 in Israel and by year 500 in Babylon. So that's why I say there's a lot to this question. So that's how Judaism, classical Judaism, becomes. I'm going to use this term, but it's really not that descriptive, standardized, because it still took time for Judaism to become standardized. But this is the foundation or framework that enables this. But what Judah did began even earlier with Yochanan ben Zakkai. Immediately upon the destruction of the temple, he brought together a group of people, and it moved from place to place. One of the significant places was a place called Yavna. It also was located for a while in Tiberias, located for a time in a place called Sippuri or Sepphoris, some significant places in Jewish history and in Israeli archaeology. Yochanan ben Zakkai, again, is a person who was alive during the destruction of the Second Temple, and he's the one who brought together or reformed the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin was in existence during Yeshua's time and prior to Yeshua's time. The Sanhedrin was reformed now to make sure that Judaism and its teachings were not lost because of the destruction of the temple. Because of his significant work there, that's why some people have thought that Judaism ceased at the year 70 and was resurrected. Usually the date that's assigned to Yavna is year 90, but the whole process is in place for at least 20 years before that. Take a deep breath. I think I covered that aspect of what I wanted to cover. I know as you were talking, we know that Jews lived in Jerusalem even after the year 70. We have one interesting example that is specifically, should I put it? significant for us as Messianic Jews. It's a place called David's Tomb. The tomb that is actually there is a tomb, but it's not David
In Jerusalem,
in Jerusalem. Thank you. In the
Mount Zion area.
the Mount Zion area. Okay, so that tomb does in fact have a body. The body happens to be a Crusader soldier. It's not David. But it is over top of an area that if you excavate underneath, and it has been excavated underneath, shows that this was in fact a synagogue. And given the excavation and the way in which the synagogue is oriented, it is a Messianic synagogue from the end of the first century. So Jews, including Messianic Jews, were around in Jerusalem even after the destruction of the temple. It's fun to figure out why that.
And all of that is like around the corner from the place where they'll take you to see the upper room.
Yes.
The upper room is situated in a building of the correct time period. It's just that the room itself is, doesn't have anything left in it. It was made into a Muslim worship place. But the building itself could be the authentic upper room building. It's just very close to David's tomb.
Yeah.
David's tomb is down down and down a little bit from the hill.
It's like, what would you say, a block or two away?
Yeah. I'd
So-
say go down the stairs and turn
Cross the
left and
street.
turn left again, and you'll be at
And you'll be
David's
there.
tomb. So although this is nowadays called the Mount Zion area, it's outside the city walls. That is not the way it was in biblical times. Remember that the city walls that are built today were built by Suleiman the Magnificent in approximately the year 1600. And those walls are mistaken. And they left out a portion of biblical Jerusalem outside the wall was left out. And it's called Mount Zion, that area that has the upper room in it and has David's tomb in it. It has Caiaphas's fortress in it. And it was part of the walled city during Yeshua's time, but it is not now. Well, how did it all get mixed up? Well, you could sort of blame the Crusaders. The Crusaders did not have very accurate information. So when they went to these different, what they considered holy places, they had priests accompanying them, and the priest would, go take them somewhere, and then the priest would get this, holy feeling in the pit of his stomach, and then they would say, well, this is that. And so it's always important to, when you go to Jerusalem, that your tour guide tells you what was true during Yeshua's time and what was true after, what it was named afterwards, because there's discrepancies all the way through, especially outside the current walls of Jerusalem.
Judaism did not need to be awakened or resurrected. It was vibrant going into the time period of the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in the year 70. It remained vibrant, largely due to the work of Yochanan ben Zakkai and then the others who helped form that Sanhedrin, and then others who continued as individual or as a people to practice their faith even after the temple was gone, because of the whole synagogue structure that had made that possible as well, that predated the destruction of the temple. And then it was, of course, it was further fortified by the work of Judah HaNasi and the people that were around him, called the Tanaim, and then a couple centuries later by the Amoraim, who were largely responsible for the codification known as the Gemara, or the discussions that in effect became part of the Gemara. Is probably a much better way to put that. It's trying to condense a lot of stuff into just a few short minutes here. I thought there was one more thing I was going to say about that, but maybe not. Oh, again, so Rabbinic Judaism does not begin with the fall of Jerusalem. Rabbinic Judaism goes back to the rabbis that predated the fall of Jerusalem, a number of whom are in fact named in the opening couple chapters of Pirkei Avot, that was written probably in the first century of the Common Era, and that in fact traces back the line of teaching, what is often called the oral Torah or the oral law, traces that back at least to the time of Ezra in the Great Synagogue, which took place at the return from the Babylonian captivity in the mid 400s. So there's that continuous line that connects Judaism all the way back. And I would say that because of the work of the people who put together the Talmud, the Mishnah, and the Gemara, and those with whom they worked, Judaism was provided with certainly an enduring framework that in fact has taken us through, despite disconnection from the land of Israel, as well as in connection with the land of Israel, even up to the present day. Today's present day versions of Judaism, at least when they first came into being, talking about Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist Judaism, just to name a few, were largely in response to what that base or that framework that is often called Rabbinic Judaism, that is certainly deeply connected to the Talmud and the other rabbinic writings in that period. You got Midrashim, you got Tosefta, you got other writings down through the Middle Ages that are later Midrashim. There's a large package of Judaism that becomes part of that history. Okay, so thank you for that question. It's an important question because it does deal with a misunderstanding that, by the way, is still prevalent in parts of Messianic Judaism. I knew there was something else I wanted to.
Well, it's prevalent in Christianity.
Yeah, it's prevalent in Christianity, but unfortunately, it's prevalent in parts of Judaism. You have parts of in Messianic Judaism, you have parts of Messianic Judaism that consider themselves biblical Jews, not rabbinic Jews. There are all kinds of problems with that particular kind of description or definition that we don't have the time to get into here, but it's a misunderstanding of the history that I tried to bring together for you in its bits and pieces. What is called Rabbinic Judaism, what is better called Classical Judaism, again, has its roots back far into the Second Temple period, and even earlier.
Yeah, Ezra is prior to the Second Temple.
Yeah. Okay.
I think part of the problem is that when you had, and I'm talking about in the 1700s to the 1800s, you had a lot of Christians thinking about Jewish history, and they were not experts in it, and they only had a broad swath in their mind of what Judaism was like. And they made a big deal about, the temple's gone and now everything's done, except the Jews had lived without a temple before the Second Temple was destroyed. They lived without a temple in Babylon, and it seemed to go pretty well. They adapted. And those in the diaspora, once again, lived without the temple because it was impossible for many of them to make Aliyah, to come to Jerusalem even once or twice. So I think it was because of a lack of understanding of how the Jewish people made it through another main time when there was no temple. And so they saw then they had to totally reinvent everything. No, they didn't have to reinvent everything. How do we know? Because Ezra was already doing things way before the destruction of the temple. And once again, I think it was done, out of a sense that, well, Christianity has a superior history and all these other religions don't have as good a history as we have. So we will now make judgments about their history, even though we're not very well educated on their history, but we know enough to say things. And that was the way things were many times in the 17 and 1800s. And that's how certain classical study ideas came into being. That you had this classical take on Judaism totally revamped, before Yavna. It's not really complete, and it's not really accurate, I don't think. I think that might have changed. That may have changed from the way it was in the 1800s. Yeah, some churches, they don't even realize that they're built on these understandings.
And like I said, some of these kinds of misunderstandings have even impacted and influenced parts of Messianic Judaism.
Well, because parts of Messianic Judaism are still totally theologically tied to Christianity.
Yeah.
And not all Christianity, just the part they like.
Okay. I want to apologize for a somewhat scattered approach to Jewish history and to the development of what's called classical Judaism.
Aren't there books that we could recommend
I was
that
trying
if
to
people
think
wanted to read? There's that Shai Cohen book, from the Mishnah to the
from the Maccabees to the Mishnah.
From the Maccabees to the Mishnah is by Shai Cohen,
Mhm.
Shai Cohen, Cohen. It will give you in-depth history of this time period that we've been talking about.
And there are others as well. If they come to mind, we'll share them during the course of this time. But anyhow, so what I've shared with you doesn't do justice to the whole story of this thing, but hopefully at least it gives you some bits and pieces of that story.
Well, and I'd also like to put in, once again, what Christian scholars know about the history of Judaism usually isn't very complete or they're not very knowledgeable. They have a broad swath in their mind, but they haven't studied, they haven't taken time to study. It's interesting that Judaism was a dead religion, and yet the prime time that's called the Golden Age of Judaism is in the Middle Ages, from about the year 900 CE to approximately year 1200 CE, when you had a unbelievably large and active Jewish community throughout the Muslim world, but especially in Spain and in the Mediterranean countries. So under the rule of the Muslim authorities, that was the time period where Islam had swept through North Africa and had even taken a great deal of Spain. During that time period is known as the Golden Age of Judaism. It's then when you had great scholars and you have great literature, all coming out of the Jewish people that had been that were living in large communities under Islamic rule, even in North Africa and Spain. It's people sometimes don't like to hear it, but Judaism flourished when Islam was in charge of the government. When Christianity was in charge of the government, they were persecuted. This is part of the Middle Ages history of the relationship between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But the Golden Age of Judaism in the Spanish Empire is really something to learn about and be happy about, and realize that the history of Judaism kept on going. They didn't just shrivel up and die after the temple was destroyed.
Two further thoughts come to mind. We covered one of the ones I thought about earlier, and I want to add to what you just said with a few names. Um, Rabbinic Judaism, as it is so often so called by those who aren't its proponents but its opponents, is set, as I said, in contrast to biblical Judaism. That is yet another part of the misunderstanding. What is rabbinic or classical Judaism is firmly founded on the biblical text. If you take a look at the pages of the Mishnah and then the Gemara, the Talmud as a whole, as well as such other classic, such other classical or rabbinic texts as the Midrashim, you will find that they are firmly based on Scripture. And so much in a couple ways. Number one, in helping to try to apply, to understand and then apply Scripture, which had been written, if we're talking about the codification of the Mishnah, which goes back at least as far as the time of Moses, so 1600 years before. They're now trying to, 1600 years later, how are we going to take these ancient principles, instructions, and guidelines, which were set way back then, and bring them into our modern age in the year 200? That was part of the role of these people called the teachers, the Tanaim, in trying to continue the process that had taken place over the years, which was applying this material from century to century as new situations arose. All right, how do we now apply this to our day and age? Because I don't want to imply that this process only took place in the year 200. It stretches through that time period. Okay, so back to 200. In 200, how does this apply to our lives today? And even when the discussions arose, how do we do this, that, or the other thing, when the answer was quite very logical and right there for you on the face or on the surface, the rabbis would find, the rabbis of the Talmud, the rabbis of these classical texts, would find a way to attach a biblical text to the conclusion, even if the conclusion was clear to all. And sometimes you can tell that they're sort of straining to find a biblical text to connect to the conclusion, even though the conclusion is clear to everyone. That's how strongly based on the biblical text these people and their thought was. Again, they're trying to interpret it for later ages. Much of the role of what's called the Midrashim is to fill in the gaps in the biblical story for those who are now reading it later and wouldn't have known what was popularly understood by the earlier writers and readers of the biblical texts. So they try to fill in the gaps. They try to deal with what appear to be contradictions at a later age. So they're all grappling with the biblical text. So anybody who goes with this silly notion of rabbinic Judaism versus biblical Judaism doesn't really understand either, I'm going to suggest. Not in a historical sense. Now, Golden Age of Judaism. Let me give you some of the names associated with that Golden Age that you may have heard. There's Rashi. There's the Rambam, Maimonides. There's the Ramban, Nachmanides. There are people such as Ibn Ezra. There are people such as the Sforno. There are all kinds of people from this time period, the Golden Age of Judaism. No, it was anything but dead. And in fact, as I said, never did die. Although there were some things that were adapted to changing times and circumstances. And that's technically the role of the rabbis even to this day. You adapt the Judaism that goes all the way back to Mount Sinai and before. You adapt that to our day and age. Okay. Now, all that were a few short lines of a question in an email. So, a few short lines do, in fact, sprout a large tree, which is my way of segueing into the next question.
Yeah, which is once again, very short.
Yes, please help explain. Okay, you ready for this? This is real short. Please help explain the tree of life. Okay. Was it originally a literal tree? If so, what happened to it? Or is it strictly symbolic? Or both? Okay.
Or not.
All right. There you go. A simple question, but boy, is there a lot to that, isn't there, when you think about it? Do you want to start with that? Since you were the,
I mean, in my mind,
Yes.
if you say the tree of life, it's in Genesis. That's where I put it.
Yeah.
It's the one in Genesis that they're told not to eat the fruit from.
no, tree of knowledge of good and evil.
I'm sorry.
And then they're prohibited from eating from the tree of life later.
Okay. See, that's why you should have started. But
Yeah.
yeah, so is it an actual tree? Yes. It's not just a metaphor? No. And for that, you should really read a short book.
Okay.
A short book called, it's Francis Schaeffer, Garden of, yeah, Francis Schaeffer, and it's a short book, and I make
I think
my
it's a book on
Genesis in Space and Time.
There you
Is
go.
what it's called. The book is called Genesis in Space and Time, in which he makes a case for saying things, especially in Genesis, the first 12 chapters, are not metaphors, they're not myths, that there were real people, and they really had a real tree, and they really ate from the wrong tree, and it cannot be just a myth and cannot be a translation of mythical ideas into the real world, but not true in the sense of cannot be touched or felt or heard or smelt. So I'd say myths have been made about the tree of life, but did it exist in space and time? Yes, it did exist in space and time. What happened to it? Well, I'm going to assume it's right where it always was. Because remember, people were kicked out of that garden where it was. And so no people have seen it since that time. Is that fair enough to say?
Yeah, it would be.
And if you want to think of it, if it's in another dimension, remember there's more than 3 dimensions. There's length, width, and height, right? That create volume. But there are other dimensions, not just the 3-dimensional world. And if you read science fiction, they'll talk all about it for a long time. And so my statement is, does the tree of life still exist? Yes. But it's in another dimension that we cannot experience the way we are because we're in a 3-dimensional world. Will we be able to experience it once we're not in the 3-dimensional world? Maybe. Let's see. It'll be something to look forward to. And I'm only mentioning the not 3-dimensional world because when little kids ask, well, where is heaven? We always point like it's in the sky. But I think most of us would say it's not really in the sky, but we can't see it right now because it's in a different dimension. And so it's not seeable to us. Is that fair enough?
Building on that, some people actually talk in terms of us living in a 4-dimensional universe, considering time as the 4th dimension. Let me do a quick tangent there and then come back with another recommendation for something to read.
I think I know what that is.
The evidence that derives from what is called in the field of physics the big or cosmology, the Big Bang theory, indicates from what we've been able to discover from all the science that surrounds that, is that the universe began literally with a big bang of some 10 or more, possibly up to a dozen different dimensions that within fractions of a microsecond collapsed into the 4 that we presently live in and know about. So there is a sense of dimensionality that astrophysics and related fields have brought us to at least, I was going to say understand, it's not really understand, but at least know about or
Appreciate.
yeah. There is an organization that was originally founded by an astrophysicist. It's called Reasons to Believe. Reasons.org is its website. There too, you will find some books. I think one of the books might in fact be Genesis and the Big Bang, but anyhow, you'll find some books on that website that deal with relating the findings of modern science to the text of the Bible, particularly related to creation, but especially to areas of science, but particularly related to the areas of creation. And it will help you try to think through how what science now provides evidence for to support the biblical text and its creation story. Now, just so you don't misunderstand that, since we got into Tree of Life in Genesis, their understanding of the age of the universe is the same. Reasons.org and the people associated with it is the same as the understanding of the age of the universe that many, if not most, scientists who are in that field feel. And we're talking about something on the order of 13, 14, 15 billion years. So they're not so don't assume that these are people who will argue that the universe is only 10,000 years old, or creation took place around the year 4000. There used to be a whole series of Bible.
4004, yeah.
Yeah. A whole discussion and almost a theology that thought that the creation began in the year 4004 BCE. So no, they're not coming from that perspective. They are truly integrating science, but they also are providing scientific evidence for the reliability of the biblical account as a historical account. I don't remember if they actually deal with the Tree of Life, but they do deal with the Garden of Eden. That's another source. So reasons.org for if you want to look at this from a scientific perspective, that'll deal with that issue. Tree of Life. Remember at the end of the Genesis chapter 3, God said, as he tossed Adam and Eve out of the garden, that they would no longer be able to eat of the fruit of that particular tree. And God set some, I think the text says, is it seraphim, cherubim? I forget which one of them. Seraphim to guard that tree so that it would
with swords.
With swords, so it would no longer be accessible. I have been trying during the whole course of this discussion to try to remember some imagery within Judaism that connects us back to the Tree of Life. And I think it's in the background of, or it echoes in some of the biblical texts, but I've not been able to recover that from my corrupted databases or databanks. But anyhow, there's another aspect of the Tree of Life that we connect with on a weekly basis as part of Shabbat. And it is in fact a liturgical piece called Etz Chaim. Etz Chaim Ki, a tree of life it is to those who take hold of it, and happy are those who support it. That section is now metaphorical, but it is based on a historical reality of the Tree of Life. And as that tree was supposed to provide life, so this tree that's mentioned in Etz Chaim, and their passages are taken from Proverbs there in that particular liturgical piece. It's a reminder that God has provided for us a source of life as found in the Torah, and then the Torah expanded through the whole of the Tanakh and through the Brit Chadashah or the Newer Testament. So that becomes for now our source of life until we get plugged into perhaps the tree of life yet again. And I say that because part of the rabbinic concept of the world to come, and this will be a transition into the last of the questions for tonight, part of the rabbinic understanding of the world to come is, it's called Gan Eden, and that refers to the Garden of Eden. The world to come will be the restoration of the Garden of Eden. In other words, the restoration of all that God intended for his universe, not just for us as people, but for the earth, for the universe as a whole. And if that rabbinic understanding is correct, that that is what we anticipate, and it appears that Isaiah happens to agree with the rabbinic understanding, or actually rabbinic understanding is built on Isaiah. The end of Isaiah, chapter 66, talks about what? A new heavens and a new earth. And the text there uses the term for new that's often used for renewed.
Renewed.
So
Heaven.
it's a
And renewed earth.
So it's not just a renewed heaven and a renewed earth. The Hebrew for heaven and earth is a phrase that specifically includes the whole of the universe. So there's a restoration of the universe. So when the rabbis argue for Gan Eden and in the restoration, they're talking about the restoration of the universe as a whole, the restoration of people, how they were intended to be, the restoration, of course, of the nation of Israel to what God had promised it would be, and the restoration of, universe, nation of Israel, us as individuals to what we were supposed to be. And so a reconnection to the tree of life. And just on the edge, I can almost see the image of the tree of life imagery that's behind a couple of the biblical texts, but I didn't quite grasp it. I was hoping the discussion would cause it to pop up into my mind. So, tree of life it is to those who take hold of it, tree of life it is, and happy are those who take hold of it. So renew our days, we say, there it is, renew our days as a role.
But in the Shabbat service, that particular piece of liturgy to me was not talking about the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. It's talking about the Torah.
It's exactly what it's talking about. And I'm sorry I didn't make that clear. That's exactly what I was referencing.
Right.
So it is, like I said, the Torah and all that's built on the Torah in the Tanakh, in the New Testament, that it forms that tree of life that enables that renewal. And in fact, renew our days as of old. The phrase "as of old" is a direct reference back to the creation account and the Garden of Eden experience. So, all right.
I thought for sure you were going to bring up, when we talked about dimensions, I thought for sure you were going to bring up the land of squares.
Oh,
because we got pieces of paper here, so it's handy.
Parable of squares in the cube, yeah.
Okay, so here is something that has length and width, so it has 2 dimensions, right? If you put it like this, it seems to have no height. It seems to have no volume, correct?
As opposed to?
A 3-dimensional something. This is 3-dimensional. Seems to be 2-dimensional, right? So the philosophers think about this idea a lot. So it's not just a scientific idea, it's a philosophical idea. Where, what is the name of that book? And it was written in the 1880s.
I forget what it is.
It has to do with a world called the world of squares.
Yeah.
So into the world of squares, let's think we have just a 2-dimensional world. Into the world of squares, there comes a square, and the square says, yes, I'm a square, but I also am a cube. But you cannot see the rest of me. You can only see my squareness. And he uses that metaphor to describe understanding Yeshua. Yes, I'm a person, but I'm more than a person. See how that works? And the squares that live in this flatland, it's called
That's right.
flatland of
Yes.
something. So if the squares that live in flatland, all they can recognize are shapes that are two-dimensional. They cannot recognize, they don't see the third dimension. It's not available for them. So when someone comes in and says, yes, I am a square, but I am 6 squares in one.
I'm a cube.
I'm a cube. And they go, well, that's impossible. We don't understand. How come we can't see them? All these questions. And for us who are in 3 dimensions, we understand the squares and their confusion because we cannot see the 4th dimension, which is time. So I'll give you my definition. My dad used to give to me back when I was teachable. No, he used to say, here's 2 things cannot occupy the same space at the same time. Yes.
Just so you know, Dad was a science teacher. Continue.
And really physics was his big thing. So 2 things cannot occupy the same space at the same time. So if we have a book here, this book cannot occupy the same space at the same time. It has to be somewhere else, correct? However, that's not entirely true. 2 books can occupy the same space, but not at the same time. So it's the time that has a dimensionality that if you could have both books in the same place at the same time, then you would have 4 dimensions. You would have 4 dimensions. And then there was the singing group that was the 5th dimension. Let's not even go there. It's way beyond our petty little problems in our world. But this is a very good explanation of why we cannot see and experience where heaven is. We cannot see and experience where hell, if it exists, the way we understand it, where it is. It's certainly not down. Heaven's certainly not up. Where is it and why can't we see it? It's in a different dimension. And for now, we'll just have to be satisfied. Just like the people, the little squares in Flatland could recognize that there could be something that was a square, and yet it was really 6 squares in one. Theoretically, they got it. They could picture it in their minds in a certain very strange way. And I think that's our problem when we try to describe things that are otherworldly in the scripture. Like, where are the angels and why can't I see them? They're in a different dimension. Just like time, the existence of time as a dimension changes our understanding of things too.
There are several theories on where we go when we die. It's the last of the questions.
Speaking of where all these places are.
Yeah. And restoration of God then. I have heard everything from spending eternity in a blissful spiritual heaven to a state of non-existence at death, followed by a return to existence on earth when we are resurrected. What do the scriptures, Older and Newer Testament, support, and what are the different viewpoints of the afterlife between these 2 testaments? The whole concept of the afterlife is not very well developed in either of the testaments. What you do here, Job references it, Isaiah references it, Daniel references it, is that there will be a resurrection of the dead. Now, the how and the what of that, we're not told. There is that same concept of resurrection also found in Corinthians and Thessalonians, just to name a couple, but it's found far more regularly in the Newer Testament. Why? Well, between the Older and the Newer Testament in the time period of late Second Temple period, Judaism continued to think and explore the concepts found in the Older Testament or the scriptures. And they developed their understanding, which then the Newer Testament builds on. And but it still isn't a very definitive kind of concept It just acknowledges that there will be a resurrection, but it doesn't tell us exactly the how and the what of that resurrection, or for that matter, to a large degree, the when of it.
Or what will it look like?
And what will it look
Which
like?
moment in time will my resurrected body look like? Will it be when I was 17 years old and was really cute? Or will it be now? So those are the kinds of questions I think people ask. Kids ask them more often, and usually older people are thinking them, but they're not asking them out
A
loud.
quick aside on what she just said. One of my favorite scenes from one of my favorite books called Prince Caspian, it's of the Narnia Chronicles, is in fact, if you read it carefully, the resurrection of said Prince Caspian. And what you see him, although previously dead, now he's in his full vigor, whatever full vigor was for him as a person. So I think C.S. Lewis got it right. I think that certainly captures some of what it would appear the resurrection brings us. Now, related to that, I was going to say building on that, related to that, the understanding of, I'm going to suggest the understanding of the afterlife, if we take seriously, number one, the new heavens and the new earth of Isaiah, and then the rabbinic understanding of Gan Eden as the restoration of Eden, then what we have in the afterlife is what we were intended to have when we as humankind, or as the universe, was created to have. In other words, the ideal. This is not the concept of the somehow we move from the physical to the metaphysical, which is almost a separation from what is physical. This is something that is truly very physical. It is, to go back to a previous discussion, full dimensional.
Mm-hmm.
It's a full dimensional reality that exists in a renewed or restored space and time the way in which God originally intended for us to have it and to live it in the Garden of Eden. Now, that means the best of what we can imagine in our world and in our universe, to an even greater degree, will take place there. Whether that has to do with science or art or food or travel or
Gardening,
sports,
sports.
but all as it was intended to be. So in other words, it's life, it's a full life, fully lived as God intended for us. And again, taking us back now a step, it is in fact hence connected once again to the tree of life. So life again in its fullest sense. So they're all, these questions, although a little different from one another, still, as it turns out, seem to be somewhat integrated in a larger picture kind of way.
So we won't have wings
I don't know if we'll have wings. I was going to say, though,
and play harps.
well, I know at least two people that will probably play harps, and they're the harpists from the Florida Orchestra. I'm sorry, there's a third. David will play it pretty well, too.
That's a different harp.
Yeah, that's a different
It's a
harp.
lyre.
That's a lyre. No, he's not.
Wrong spelling. Kinnor. In
Yes.
Bivrit, in Hebrew, what he plays is a kinnor.
That reminded me of a Hebrew song, but I'll leave
Let's
that.
not.
Let's not go there. Where was I? I think I had one more thing. So life at its fullest, as it was intended originally, now
And we'll be
restored.
recognizable to each other.
Yes.
We'll be it doesn't, in a certain way, doesn't matter how old we are, what moment it is of us, but we will be recognizable. There will be something about us that we know each other.
Yeah.
It's not like, who are you? Because you don't look at all like Uncle Fred, kind of thing.
Two further thoughts to add here, and it builds on what you just said, and thank you for saying that. We know somewhat of what the resurrected body will be like. Why? Because Yeshua walked around in his resurrected body and what happened when he walked around. He was at times recognizable, other times not. Why wasn't he recognizable at other times? I'm going to suggest because they didn't expect to see him that way. But at other times, he was clearly recognizable. And it was something that was not just purely physical as opposed to spiritual or metaphysical, because he ate and he drank and he said to Thomas, go ahead, grab hold of my hands, my feet. Actually, the women grabbed hold of his feet first at the garden.
If you say so.
So there is some sense of corporeality to the resurrected body. In 1 Corinthians 15, he said there are the rabbi says there are bodies that are terrestrial and there are bodies that, I almost said extraterrestrial. It's not really extraterrestrial. It is supra-terrestrial. It's terrestrial and even more. And that has to do with the transformation of the body in its to its more resurrected state. However and whenever that takes place. For some people, it takes place before they actually get dead and buried. For some people, it takes place after they've been dead and buried. Now, if they've been dead and buried, what happens to them? That's part of this question. That brings me to the second point, and that's 2 Corinthians chapter 5, where the rabbi argues there quite earnestly that his expectation, if you read carefully, is not to be unembodied or disembodied. He expects that at death, he is somehow embodied. Okay? First paragraph of 2 Corinthians 5. He does not want to be houseless or unclothed, he says. He expects to be clothed and housed. And in that sense, it's a reference to some kind of resurrection body. Now, how can he already have the resurrected body when we are here sitting around and we are not yet don't yet have our resurrected body?
Some of us are missing parts.
Yes, some of us are missing parts. I'm tempted to go down that bunny hole, but I'm not going to. No.
Insert your own joke there.
Yes. Resurrected body of some sort. Because he's also the author of 1 Thessalonians 4, where he talks about the time of transformation, when those who have already passed on to the next life will come back with Yeshua, and we who are still alive will then be transformed from our present lives to whatever that renewed, I think much better, renewed life is going to be. So did he already get it and we didn't yet? Back once again to loop through yet another, to the dimensions of space and time. God is a God, if he created a universe that was at least 10 dimensions, is a God of at least 11, if not a dozen or more dimensions. And from that kind of supradimensionality, then, he is above and beyond time. And if he's above and beyond time, maybe we then move to a status of above and beyond time, in which case everything occurs, to use a time term, simultaneously. That would mean then, as one of my former associates pointed out or suggested, that when Rav Shaul died, he was then resurrected, and he moved into that non-temporal dimensionality. But that means that when we get ultimately resurrected, it will be as if we've also moved in at the same time into that non-dimensional or trans-temporal dimensionality.
Trans-temporal, I like that.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Let's
copyright.
Definitely copyrighted. All right. So therefore, what is considered temporal in our timeline or dimensionality goes beyond that in God's ultra-dimensionality. And interestingly enough, a 15th century rabbi in a midrash from back then reflected on exactly that before we even knew of that kind of dimensionality. Because what he says, when I share this in a couple of classes, is from God's perspective, past, present, and future is all one point in time. So when we make a decision, so God's so-called foreknowledge does not impact the decisions we make, because God's knowledge outside of time takes place at the same time that we're making the dimensions. Or making our decisions, not dimensions. Decisions, not dimensions. Okay, now that's easily said, not easily comprehended. But think about that for a while, and if your brain explodes, so be it. Because God is outside of
He's outside of the space-time continuum.
He's outside of the space-time continuum, that everything happens at the same point in what we call time for him. So his foreknowledge of an event does not mean that he has caused us to make that decision.
He's observed us making the decision.
And in fact, all decisions at the same time, given this particular understanding. Fair enough? So we've now come
it's
full circle.
It really is like the cube. I'm a square, but I'm 6 squares in 1.
I'm a cube.
I'm a cube. And we're going like this. Okay. And we cannot really comprehend it. But I think that's part of what our faith is important, why it's important. Because things like the answers to these questions, we have to take on faith, because we cannot prove it scientifically.
Yeah.
We can only use metaphors.
Yeah.
That's all we can really use is a metaphor.
But there are some scientific indicators that help us better understand if we can grapple with that part of the science.
Correct.
So, yeah, all things occur. All things for God are outside of time. We're the ones who are subject.
We have that limitation on us.
So it answers the question that was raised. What happens in between death and resurrection in the ultimate sense? And if this is a correct understanding, and I believe it is, the resurrection occurs for us all, as it has throughout all of time, at the same time, but outside of time. And I see a couple of smiles out there. So, and we, speaking of time, we have exceeded our time.
Ding, 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 ding.
But we don't want to violate a timeless principle for us in stars, and that is, if you have questions, either the you present in this room or the you that we can see on the screen, please feel free to ask them.
May we ask them now?
Sure.
Yes.
In this last discussion that we've had, when it talks about Lazarus and Abraham, Lazarus and the rich man, it almost seems like the rich man is in some sort of hell. And there's another passage in Peter or something where Yeshua has the keys to death and hell. Is there some concept that people tend to go to hell before their resurrected bodies?
Yeah, there is some concept of that people have. There's also connected with it a concept of purgatory. There's a concept of what's called, from that particular passage, Abraham's bosom, which is sort of a pleasant
waiting area.
A pleasant waiting area.
A holding cell.
Yeah, holding cell.
But a nice one.
But a nice one. Well, that could take a whole lot. I would like to say we don't have time for that question right now. But I would remind you that the story of Lazarus is in fact a story that is probably functions very much more like a parable than as and therefore a way to
factual story.
Yes, a way to help understand certain things, and isn't necessarily a description of things as they are, as parables were intended to be. And I'm using parable in even a larger sense than the specific technical descriptor for a
A
parable.
teaching tool.
A teaching tool, a metaphorical teaching tool. Yeshua has the key to death and hell.
That means he's in control of it.
He's in control of it. And in the image or metaphorical sense, that means he's the one that it enables people to be set free from death and hell. That doesn't mean that they are necessarily already there. It means he's the one who frees them. It's very much in line with the passage from Hebrews chapter 2, I think it's verse 14 or 15. Jessica, did I mention that passage in class Thursday night?
Which one? Hebrews 2.
By his death, he has freed from death. He has set free from the one who has the power over in sin and death, those who are subject to death.
Maybe not specifically, but you did cover that topic.
I thought so. So,
Yeah.
Barbara, you were in the class as well. I'm thinking
Right.
that's when we dealt with it. I think that passage from Hebrews chapter 2 applies here as well. By death, he is set free from death and free from the power of the one who has the power over sin and death. In this case, more likely reference to Hasatan. Those who are his own. You found the text, so I don't butcher it.
And
To
what?
here we go. All right. Since this is Hebrews 2:14, since then the children share in flesh and blood, or are human, he himself also partook the same, that through death he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is the devil. So I've added into it the concept of him freeing us from death, hence the keys, as a way of releasing people. So yes, that is sort of a related question, and hopefully we've answered it in a timely fashion.
Thank you.
Equitably.
I have another one. Going back to the tree of life, is it taking it too far to think of the tree of life as this execution stake of Yeshua?
Yes. And that's a good question. What it is if we understand and in fact translate it as the execution tree or stake, we can better, rather than always call it the cross, we can better see the resonance with that. We now have access, in a sense, to that tree of life because he was executed on another tree that we might call a tree of death. It was a tree of death for him, and there were trees of death for others as well. So there is perhaps a literary resonance or echo. But I wouldn't go beyond that. But that's a very good question. Okay. Any others? Becky? Yeah, it's a literary image.
It's a metaphor.
Yeah, a literary metaphor. Thank you.
The known compared to the unknown.
Yeah.
That's what the base definition of a metaphor is. Something that's known compared with something that's unknown, with the object of learning something about the unknown.
All right. Then would you close for us in prayer?
Okay. Avinu Malchenu, our Father and our King. You are a great God, and it is a privilege to serve you. Thank you for listening to our questions. Thank you for giving us some answers. Help us to read your word more diligently. Help us to be open to learning about your creation, and help us to be satisfied with the answers that we are given along the way. We thank you for leaving us your scriptures that we can learn from them. Help us to be diligent students of the scriptures as we walk from day to day. Be with us and show us the paths that you would take us on, and give us encouragement, give us bravery, and give us peace along the way. We thank you for all these things. B'Shem Yeshua Meshachenu, in the name of Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen.
Yes, and I like that prayer, that we should be diligent students, which automatically reminded me of the rabbis of the so-called rabbinic Judaism, because they were diligent students. We have the wisdom that they have left behind for us. Going all the way back to the time of Ezra, perhaps even Moses. All right. Thank you again.
Lehitraot.
Oh, yes.
Shabbat Tov, Chag Sameach.
Yes, Chag Sameach. Have a great Passover. We'll see you on the flip side. Literally.
Like,
It'll be like a day after Passover.
that's next week. Oh, you mean after, so 2 weeks.
Yes.
We meet again in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Thank you and good night.
Good night.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.